Hi there. My name is Matt Mulcahy from ProSource, and this is our third episode of our Ask a Pro webinar. Today, we're focusing on attack vectors and vulnerability management. On the call with me, I have Chad, our Director of Security Operations, and Rick, CEO of Atlas Inside. And we're going to look at some of the popular attack vectors that are in use today and being used successfully to compromise businesses, and also how we handle vulnerabilities on a day-to-day basis. To get started, I just wanted to walk through a couple introductions. And first up, we have Rick Valdes, the CEO of Atlas Inside. Go ahead, Rick.
Thank you, Matthew. Well, I've been working on the cybersecurity industry for the last 10 years. And at Atlas Inside, we specialize in developing solutions for managed services providers. So today, we're going to be discussing attack vectors and how to mitigate the most frequent ways that attackers leverage to compromise organizations.
Thanks, Rick. Next up, we've got Chad.
Hey, I'm Chad Holstein. I've been with ProSource for about 3 years now. I'm in charge of the initiatives around security and compliance and protecting not only our systems, but our clients as well.
Great. Last but not least, myself. My name is Matt Mulcahy. I've been at ProSource for about 7.5 years. Director of Business Development now. I oversee our sales and marketing and making sure our customers understand what it takes to be safe and grow their business in 2022. First off, we're going to touch on the popular attack vectors. Rick is going to talk about what they see in their operation and their security operations center being the most popular and successful vectors for compromise.
Thank you, Matt. Well, the number one thing we're seeing right now in our security operations center is how attackers leverage credentials that are exposed on the dark web. Everyone hears from time to time about big guys falling victims of an attack and their entire database of customers going to the dark web. However, this occurs very often, and not only to the big guys, happens also to smaller companies. So let's suppose that one of your employees has an account at Adobe. We all know Adobe had a data breach like a year ago. So there is a 72% chance that the same person that had his account breached at Adobe was using the same password in your enterprise applications. So what attackers are doing is they are going into the dark web, they're getting those databases with the list of credentials, and they use that information to try to gain access to the enterprise applications of your company. Also, they use legitimate resources like SharePoint, HTML websites hosted in SharePoint, or even PDF hosted in SharePoint to leverage, basically use the account of someone they gain access to and expose those resources there and basically make users enter information into those resources or gather information using those legitimate resources, which makes it harder for antivirus and HTTP systems to detect. One might think, well, we have two-factor authentication for that. Well, two-factor authentication or MFA is not always enough. There are many ways to bypass that, and many organizations don't have strong policies implemented around two-factor authentication to prevent attackers from using legacy protocols that could bypass that two-factor authentication. Finally, the third and most common attack vector we are seeing is companies embedding malicious code inside legitimate applications. We see that even in the cybersecurity industry. Cybersecurity vendors that distribute applications like antivirus, for example, if they get like a DNS poisoning attack or a malicious actor gains access to their DevOps build servers, they embed malicious code into the files. And when these applications that have a legitimate signature execute, then the malicious code would be executed under a legitimate process name, making it harder to detect by antivirus software. So the best way to mitigate this, there are multiple ways to do it, but that's a question for the next.
Perfect. Thanks, Rick. So really, Rick oversees a SOC, and they look at thousands of alerts in a given day and understand what the prevalent vectors are that malicious actors are using to access sensitive company data. The other piece of the pie here are vulnerabilities. That is a very large sector in which malicious actors are being successful. So Chad's going to touch on how you manage vulnerabilities and what that looks like operationally. Go ahead, Chad. You're muted.
Thanks,
Yep,
Matt.
no problem.
Yeah, so we have some reactive measures that we kind of care for internally. How are we alerted on vulnerabilities? We have an established ProSource security team internally, and we monitor basically. We partner with Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA for short, and they send us. It's a wide range of vulnerabilities. It could be software related, it could be hardware related, infrastructure. We also have direct relationships with our vendors that we support. And we have our security operations center as well, Rick and his team that are monitoring in the background logs, all that sort of data. How do we address vulnerabilities? This one's very, very important. So a lot, as we're alerted, we get actions to take along with the vulnerability that's in place that's been identified, whether it's 0-day or something that is really just discovered. We assess the risk. So it's you have a CVSS score that comes through from the vendor, basically saying, on a scale of 0 to 10, is this very emergent? Is it very damaging to the infrastructure, whatever the vulnerability is for? So we kind of assess that, and then we actually practice change management internally. So change management is breaking down the process in which you're going to implement the mitigation. And then we actually carry out the mitigation. We apply patches, firmware updates that are required to kind of get around this vulnerability or fix the issue. Then we continue to monitor as a company. So it's round robin. It just kind of stays in a loop. We're constantly doing this for not only ourselves but our clients. And then there's also a proactive piece of this. So the ways you can be proactive are doing things like vulnerability scans, security awareness training for your staff, and have cybersecurity insurance in place. These are all very, very important in not only our organization but yours as well.
Great. Thanks, Chad. So why don't you talk about, how do we approach all of the vulnerability alerts that we get and all of the logging alerts that we get, and what are some methods you put in place to really surface what's important versus all of the noise?
Risk assessment is a big part of it. We just because something is a high risk doesn't necessarily mean that the systems that we have in place are affected as such. So you may have authentication bypass vulnerability, and that specifically is very scary. But if it's not a web-facing system or something like that, it's not as vulnerable. You know what I mean? You have to have access directly to that system on site somewhere to utilize or attack with that against the vulnerability. It's a different scenario. So you always have to think outside of the box of just the vulnerability itself and assess the customer, or the system you're working with.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks. So I'm going to move into my slide here, and I really want to take what Rick and Chad talked about, the vectors and the nitty gritty of how we're handling vulnerabilities and that those internal dilemmas and conversations, and relate them to your business and what that means from a risk perspective. So the most important thing is to stay on top of what's happening. You have to understand what's current. The bad actors are always trying to stay a step ahead of not only us, but our security vendors like Rick, or even the federal government and the guidelines that they are putting out to the private sector. So keeping up with this alone is a full-time job. And then structuring your defenses against these ever evolving malicious actors is also a full-time job. And you have to understand that no one is ever 100% safe. All you can do is move yourself the closest you can to that 99 percentile. And everyone is at a different point in their security journey. So going back to what Chad said is that you have to understand your risk. You have to start with a baseline and you work up from there. So understanding where your company is today and where you want to be tomorrow is very important, and working with someone to help you chart that path is critical. Um,
Absolutely.
Something,
Yeah.
yeah, something that's consistent for every business is the weakest link are your people. You can have the best firewalls, you can have the best, email spam filtering, you can have the best SOC, the best SIM, but that can all be blown open by somebody clicking the link, someone circumventing controls that are in place. So training up your people is something that we preach very strongly because they can undercut a large cybersecurity investment or very robust cybersecurity controls, and understanding the controls you have, and layering those controls to make a patchwork and really build a comprehensive strategy for cybersecurity and defending against the attack vectors we spoke about today is key. And that's really building a multi-layered security approach. So, understanding the current methods of how people are attacking businesses and what's successful. Really, you want to defend them against the successful things. It doesn't really make sense to invest against a method that's not really at use or has already been addressed by firmware updates or something.
Right. Right.
And layering security to patch all of those holes. As a firewall might protect you and your edge network, but cybersecurity awareness training is going to protect you from your employees clicking that bad link. So layering that in an intelligent manner gives you that comprehensive protection. So we've got a couple of questions in the chat here that I wanted to pose to Rick and Chad. The first
Sure.
one from John is, what is the last vulnerability you were alerted to? Chad, you kind of head that up. Why don't you answer that one?
Yeah. So we had actually Fortinet posted a vulnerability for the FortiOS authentication bypass on administrative interface. It's a very serious one. It's rated 9.6 out of 10. So this goes out to firewalls, switches, any of their FortiOS products that are out there in the wild. We have some clients that have these systems in place, or these systems in place. We had to actually go through and assess the risk. We found that in this case that neither client that has these systems was affected. So in this scenario, we didn't have to do anything, and that's great. We actually we we talked to them, and we actually asked them if we can go ahead and just upgrade their firmware to the latest version, just to stay up to date. And the latest version is also not affected by this vulnerability. But in this case and scenario, we did not actually have to do anything whatsoever, it's not a bad thing.
So you touched on something interesting there, Chad, that sometimes you don't have to upgrade or be on the latest firmware to be safe. And we've even seen instances where being on the latest and greatest firmware or software actually exposes you to more risk because those changes in code are open new vectors for people to attack. So there's a balance to being on the latest while also being on the most secure based on attack vectors and vulnerabilities. So
Agreed.
it's kind of like a misnomer that just because you're on the newest, you're the safest, when that isn't necessarily always true. It can be true sometimes.
Right.
So good.
There's definitely some due diligence there.
Right.
Doing your research and making sure that latest and greatest is there's not too many changes. You understand what was changed,
Right.
and the change log, that kind of thing, before you put things in place. That all kind of rolls around to change management, and controlling the mitigation is really what you're doing. You're laying out the foundation of what you're doing to mitigate the vulnerability.
Yep. So funny you say that. Speaking of mitigation, Sherry asks, how can you mitigate against these different threat vectors? Rick, do you want to take that one?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
How do you mitigate against all these different threat vectors?
Well, there are two things that can be done here. So the first thing is having a multi-layer approach. When it comes to dark web attacks, because credentials get linked to the dark web, well, the best way is probably to have a dark web monitoring service, or maybe a password manager that sometimes have that type of services built in. The second thing around, MFA bypass is having strong policies implemented, especially in Office 365. We have been seeing that many organizations have multi-factor authentication implemented, but they are still allowing legacy protocols to communicate without having to go through two-factor authentication because, obviously it's not supported, but there are other ways around that. And finally, when it comes to command and control, coming from code that is embedded inside applications that are trusted. Even though the code is running from trusted applications, there are always things that are going to identify the attack patterns. For example, even though the code is running from a legitimate application, it will always try to connect to an external IP to basically grab the commands that have to be executed. Or sometimes the piece of code basically can be identified as a specific section of a binary in a file. And these are things that threat intelligence systems and SIEMs that are able to leverage threat intelligence systems are able to detect. So the short answer here would be have a strong SIEM, have a strong SOC. Again, there are multiple ways to tackle this issue, but the simple answer is have a multi-layered approach to cybersecurity and use the tools that are best for each mitigation for each use case.
Right.
Yeah, so
defense in depth. Yep. Sure.
So it seems like it's important to understand what the successful vectors that are being leveraged are and really mapping your security defenses to make sure you're appropriately protected. The last question was kind of a repeat, so I'm not going to read that. But yeah, we try to keep these short. We don't want to take up an hour of anyone's day, an entire lunch session. We want to give some time back to everybody. So I really hope that everyone was able to learn what are the popular attack vectors that are that we are seeing as a team here. We use Rick and his team on our security operations center and our security and event management platform. So together we've talked all the time, probably every week. What are we seeing? Because it's important for us to keep up and be on the bleeding edge and keep pace with these bad actors to ensure that we're applying our security approaches properly and making sure we're protected and our clients are protected as well. If you have any questions for any of the speakers on the webinar, I've got our contact info up on the screen. You can also check out our websites, atlasinside.com for Rick, getprosource.com for Chad and I. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out and look forward to seeing everyone on episode 4. Thanks so much. Have a great day.